Episode number 146 of the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. Welcome to the Wholesome Fertility Podcast. I'm Michelle, a fertility acupuncturist here to provide you with resources on how to create a wholesome approach to your fertility journey. My guest today is Jennifer Gobrecht. Jennifer was told by doctors at the age of 17 that she was unlikely to have a child because she was born without a womb. This is because Jennifer has a rare genetic condition referred to as MRKH and occurs in approximately 1 in every 14,500 women. Jennifer signed up for a trial at Penn Medicine to receive a uterine transplant in 2018, and this was a very complicated procedure that took 10 hours. After her long and difficult journey, Jennifer became pregnant and welcomed a beautiful baby boy. I am so excited for you to hear her miraculous story. So welcome to the podcast, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me, Michelle.
So your story is so amazing. So we just started the pre-talk and I'm like, wait, I have to record this because it was like really good information. So can you share just really how you figured out that this was a thing and how you were just talking about Sweden?
Yeah.
I'll let you tell the whole story.
Of course. So right around the time my husband and I got married, it was about 2014, we started hearing stories about the Swedish living donor uterus transplant trials. And the reason Sweden started doing these uterus transplants is because surrogacy is actually illegal in Sweden. So the only way women with uterine factor infertility or medically induced hysterectomies at a young age can carry or have biological children would be through uterus transplants. So my husband and I just found that the science was so interesting. And we were like, that is such a great thing to happen, for women with, my type of condition, which is a bit of a mouthful. It's called Mayer-Rokitansky-Kuster-Hauser syndrome. It's actually named after the 4 doctors who discovered this condition in women. Mm-hmm. And so we just call it MRKH for short, and I'll probably use that for the rest. Just because,
I did that for the intro because I'm like, I'm just not gonna.
But yeah, we just thought it was so fascinating. So we just started following a lot of the stories about it. And then what was really interesting is the main physician from Sweden came to America, to Texas, and started doing living uterus transplants at Baylor Hospital at their clinical trial. And, we're in a lot of online support groups for women with MRKH, and we were always talking about, this place now has trials. Like, how interesting is that? And I actually got to connect with some of the women who had living donor uterus transplant trials at the Texas site. And then one day someone posts a clinical trial for Penn Medicine. And I'm like, wow, that's in my backyard. Yeah. I'm just going to try this. I'm sure there's hundreds of women, applying for this. It's a pretty common diagnosis to have uterine factor infertility. That occurs in 1 in 500 women. My particular MRKH is 1 in 4,500, and living in such a populous area, there was a lot of applicants for the Penn Medicine trial. So I was like, I'm just going to throw my hat in the ring, see how it goes. My husband and I didn't really think much of it, but literally 3 days later, I get a call that they were interested in having me go through their evaluation process.
Wow! And
that was something that made it kind of start to click. Like, oh, this might actually be an option for us to pursue. And at that point in our lives and in our marriage, we had already done 1 cycle of IVF because we were hoping to do and just started, contacting surrogacy agencies. And we're like, well, we have some embryos and this is an option to use them. So let's see how this goes, how this pans out.
Amazing. And so how did it, obviously it was a little more complicated than a normal thing because it was a 10-hour procedure.
Yeah. So actually with the particular trial they were doing, they wanted to be one of the first hospitals in the world to do deceased donor transplants. And there is a difference between the two styles. Obviously, when you are taking a uterus from a living person and donating it to another person, you can't take as many blood cells or blood vessels. And there's a lot more risk on the person donating their uterus.
Right.
But when you're using a deceased donor transplant, you can take a lot more blood vessels. The recipient is at the same risk that they would be. And there's a lot of, interesting studies on, what the different outcomes are for each style, but they hadn't been able to do a deceased one yet. They started with living, and this particular trial wanted to try a deceased donor one. There was another trial that was happening at the same time in Brazil. So when I had applied, we knew that Brazil was also pursuing this kind of uterus transplant. And with our evaluation process, it was going to be months of evaluation. Because it was a clinical trial in the US, there was going to be 2 styles of reviews. So there was an internal approval process, and then it goes to an external board where they don't have any, identifying information about me. They just see my stats of what came about my evaluation. So you have a pretty rigorous schedule to meet with the maternal fetal medicine team, the surgery team that would do the surgery, which is usually comprised of someone who does transplants and someone who does hysterectomies. So kind of those 2 types of surgeons that I met with. And then obviously fertility, and the main person that was running the program was part of a fertility clinic at that hospital. I met with social workers to talk about support, because you need a lot of support with this type of transplant. I also met with the transplant teams and their medical pharmacists to talk through the regimen, because it's a very intense regimen of medications you have to take. I also met with dietitians, because transplant diets are a little different and very rigorous to kind of keep on, steady with. So I was meeting with all of these different groups. And then there's also a psychological evaluation to make sure that you're psychologically prepared to take on something so robust as a person going through a major medical procedure that would have months of lasting effects. So, as I said, I'm meeting, months and months with these different teams, talking with, not just myself, but also my husband, to make sure, he was prepared to kind of be a support system with this process. We also opted through this process to do another cycle of IVF, just because looking at the very little stats of some of the living donor transplants, they did require multiple frozen embryo transfers. And we just wanted to make sure that if that was the case, trying to do IVF after a transplant would be even, tougher than a normal situation.
Right.
So, this happens over the course of a few months. We were able to pass the internal review and the external review. And then it was the waiting game, which is a little different than the living transplants, is you're waiting for, a deceased donor to match.
Right.
So just like a person who would match with like a kidney, you're on a list and you never know when you're going to get that call.
Right.
And it was only maybe like 2 months after we were listed that we got a call that they found a match for me.
Oh my God. That's crazy. Amazing.
So I'm at work and I get a call, and I have a big event the next day, and they're like, "We have a donor for you. We need you to come to the hospital tomorrow." And I was like, "All right, we're ready. We're doing this."
Yeah.
So we go to the hospital on a Saturday. I get prepped that day. My husband and I are both like in shock still. We thought, it would take a while to match. So probably about in like the early mornings, like a little after, midnight, we have the surgery, and it was about 10 hours long. Mm-hmm. As I said, there was a whole team of people, transplant surgeons and gynecological surgeons all in that room sewing me up. Some of the different trials have different styles of transplant.
Like protocols.
protocol. So what was interesting is I only had to have my lower half of my abdomen operated on. So my scar and my incision was only from my belly button down. Some of the other trials are actually like full, has a higher incision. So I thought that was very interesting. That even between the different surgeons, they do different styles of surgery. So there was about, I think, 20 staples when I woke up, and
wow.
I was in shock that it happened. It went, I mean, you know, you're put out, and then they're like, it's 10 hours later, and my husband's like, so you had a transplant. And I probably was in the hospital for maybe about a week to kind of get back on my feet and start learning my new medicine regimen. It could be a mix of different antibiotics, antivirals, obviously immunosuppressive drugs for the actual transplant itself. And then obviously drugs to kind of counterbalance some of the side effects of those drugs. So, you know, things like Pepcid and antacids and everything.
Yeah.
So, you know, in a day, I was probably taking around 37 pills. And with the transplant, I was doing a lot of blood draws at the hospital just to make sure there was no rejection signs, that all my levels of all my other organs were working well.
Right.
It was a very heavily monitored process, but after the surgery, I was probably back at work like 6 weeks. Probably could have gone back a little earlier, but it fell around the holidays, and I was like, I'm just going to take a little extra holiday break.
Yeah. You needed
it. I was back at work in 6 weeks, and then it was just kind of waiting to start doing embryo transfers. And, you know, originally with a lot of the trials, they wanted to wait a year after surgery, but then some of the trials started with the living donors trying it at 6 months and saw some good results there. So they said, let's try at 6 months, we'll do a frozen embryo transfer. And our first embryo took, which was crazy. They said they were going to call us one day to let us know how the results were. And of course, my husband and I were like, oh, we'll record this. If it's happy news, like we'll have it. And then if it's not, we'll just delete it.
Yeah.
But we're so happy we did that, because like just hearing those words, you know, you're pregnant, it's something that really was so hard to sink in, because ever since I was 17 years old, I was told I would never be pregnant, that it was physically impossible for me. So to not only have that opportunity to hear those words and then to experience the pregnancy, like it was against every odd that was stacked up against me.
I'm getting chills and goosebumps all over my body as you're speaking right now.
It was, the whole process was like an out-of-body experience, because it just seemed so lucky to not only have it be close, but to be successful, and to show that this was really another option for women who were in my situation, who not only had infertility, but have known about their infertility since they were young teenagers, and to have to plan their life around knowing that building a family was going to be a process.
Yeah.
And for us, this is just another process and an option for people in our situation.
Yeah. Oh my God. It's incredible.
And for the most part, the pregnancy was a really easy pregnancy. I have friends who get mad at me because they're like, you never got morning sickness or anything. And I was like, I'm okay with that. I dealt with a lot of other things.
Right. Totally.
But yeah, and then, you know, fast forward, I did have some preeclampsia at the end, so he was a little early, but healthy. We were in the NICU for a little bit, but he was just a feeder and grower, no other issues. He's a pretty happy guy now. It was something that happened so fast. You know, from the time we applied to the time we had a baby in our arms, maybe a year and a half, which is crazy. But for us, you know, for myself, I'd been dealing with the effects of infertility for 15 years at that point, you know, making a lot of intense plans at a young age because I knew I would need to do that. And going through IVF twice, it's always a process.
Yeah.
And then obviously the transplant, that was a rigorous process. And it was a daily, I had to work at it daily. I had to, stick to my regimens. I had to stick to my checkups. I had to stick to, making sure that we were keeping everything on par with what they were, hoping to do with the trial and the transplant. And what's very interesting about these transplants, they're only temporary. So you have the options to try to do up to 2 births. We decided to only do 1 because of the preeclampsia. And we were also, just trying to keep me on the immunosuppressive drugs for as short as possible. So once we had gone into labor and had the baby, we had them do what was a cesarean hysterectomy. So I no longer have the transplant, but I also no longer have to take those immunosuppressive drugs.
Right.
And so being off of that regimen and kind of being back to my healthy, normal self, that's something these trials are all looking at to see, short-term versus long-term effects of these things. And if there's any ways that they can improve the care for people who need long-term transplants.
Right.
So
it is just, it's so remarkable how far science has come. And it's incredible that this is what we have today. I mean, because if you look back, there would have been no option, 0. Even for surrogacy back in the day, it's just like how it's come to this point is absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, and if you would have told me, 15 years ago that this was something that would happen, I would have said, that sounds like science fiction. It seems almost unreal. And now, being one of the first people to go through this, there's been dozens of more women who have gone through it. There's stories in the news every day of more successes. And it's just something that is so incredible to be a part of. It's so incredible to connect with these different women. Because I was definitely messaging the women at Baylor who had the living ones being like, what happened when this occurred? Or like, how did you deal with this? Just having that support system starting to create from the ground up. Now there's my one surgeon now is starting not a clinical trial, but a real program, a real option for women to have her own program now in Alabama. And there's now women getting to apply for that program. And it's out of clinical trial phrases. It's a real option now.
That's amazing. And the price must be crazy. Is there insurance? Does insurance cover it? How does that work?
So all clinical trials are done by hospital funding. So
but when it's a real program,
they still have support through the hospital. The only things that with these processes that you are required to pay for is your IVF expenditures. But everything else is still funded at this point through the hospitals.
Right.
It's just a different approach than a clinical trial because there's different items you would need to use in the trials versus it being a real program that's funded by the hospital.
And when you get a transplant, do you have to forever take the immunosuppressants?
You absolutely have to, yes.
Because otherwise your body will fight it because it's a foreign entity. It perceives it as a foreign entity.
Yeah, so just like any other organ, you have to take the immunosuppressive drugs. They use from the beginning, though, the same regimens they would use for women who become pregnant that have other types of transplants. So they know that these types of drugs have worked with women who have had pregnancies and have been on immunosuppressive drugs. So women who have had kidney transplants that became pregnant later. They make sure that the immunosuppressive drugs that they have in these regimens are, ones that have been used safely in pregnancies before.
Right. And then, so you were saying that typically it'll last like 1 or 2 births. 2 at max so far, from what they've
2
seen.
is max for every. Yep. Every program and trial have 2 as the max. But it all depends on your case too.
Right. Because you had a specific condition, so you obviously want to be careful.
And so, yeah, so when, there's anything that, would start to, they monitor, as I said, very heavily. You're going to a lot of appointments. You're meeting with different groups all the time to make sure, all those people I mentioned through the evaluation, you're, having appointments with them too, to make sure, whatever area they expertise in, that everything in that area is doing great. So
yeah,
I definitely felt that not only were they very heavily involved, but they were very supportive. If I had any questions throughout the process, if anything, seemed off, I could always call or text, and they would, help, troubleshoot or, talk through whatever was going on. I know something that was part of my process was I got a lot of chronic UTIs. So that was always, I was more susceptible to infections being,
Right.
Immunocompromised.
Yeah.
And, for me, I was always kind of somebody who had those chronically anyways, and it just seemed to ramp up while I had the transplant.
Right.
So always being like, I think I have another UTI again. Little TMI, but, we gotta address it. But those are things that I had to, think about. And I always joked I would go a lot of places with a mask just because I didn't want to get the flu or the cold or anything. And I was like, I was wearing masks before it was needed. So I had a stockpile already.
Yeah.
But, it's just, when you're immunocompromised, you're just a little more.
Of course, yeah.
A little more, concerned about, germs and getting sick, just because I knew I was already susceptible to getting sick.
And now that obviously you're past it, you've done the hysterectomy, how are you feeling in general overall? Has it affected you, or it just kind of like pretty much went away?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much after everything was done, obviously the normal healing from like a C-section and a hysterectomy, but like back to my normal levels, back to my normal self, back to my normal, exercising routine, no other health concerns. And they still, throughout 2 years post, they want to just do, blood draws and check-ins as part of the trial, just to make sure everything's looking good. But so far, no lasting issues, which is great. I can be a pretty active mom now.
That's awesome. Amazing. And are you thinking about surrogacy, or are you thinking about anything else, or you're good?
We're just happy right now. We never even thought we'd have one child, or we knew, getting to one child was going to be an intense process. And we are very much like, we're going to enjoy this now and like not close any doors, but, be happy in the moment.
Yeah.
And, especially going from that trial right into like a quarantine lifestyle. Now we're actually getting to do the things where like experience a little bit more of the world as a family, which has been great. So that's been definitely something that we're just happy to have him, and he's healthy and a really happy bud.
Oh, that's amazing. It is so miraculous. And of course, I'm sure you're like, I can't even believe I got this gift, because in the way that you did, it's really, I mean, you could write a book.
I hope someday I can. Having the mental time to do that is part of it.
That's a whole other project.
It will be a project, but it's definitely something that we reflect on every now and then, that like my husband and I will sit on the couch and we're like, we did that. We went through that. And like, we'll look at our son and we're like, he's here because we took a leap of faith, and really trusted in these surgeons and in these doctors to make this happen. And I have absolutely no regrets about how anything happened, and have been so happy that I had that experience.
It's incredible. It is just, when I saw your story, I was like, I have to share this, because you don't know how miracles are going to take place. Miracles do happen, and you just sometimes you can't even, in your wildest dreams, imagine how, but somehow it kind of comes at your doorstep. It just like literally comes in front of you.
I know. And we cannot believe it sometimes. Like for us, we're like, this is right by us. This is right in our backyard. Like feels like it's like falling in our lap. So for us, it was something that we are just so incredibly blessed and lucky to have been able to be a part of.
Without a doubt. Oh my God. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. I mean, this is such a beautiful story, and I'm just imagining so many people going through the fertility journey, however that looks like, it always feels like a loss of hope. And when you actually listen to these stories and hear something that goes against reality, and it goes against what you can ever imagine as a possibility to really happen, I consider it a true living miracle.
Well, I appreciate that. And I know from my end of things, what I'd hope that, people going through infertility think about is, think outside the box. There's always different options and different ways to process it. And don't feel like you have to settle for something. Try different things. That's what I did. And I am so happy I took a bit of a gamble, but now it's something that's real, and it can help so many more families.
That's fantastic. And I know you have a great Instagram, so people can come and see you and check you out and your story. Can you share that?
Yeah, it's just a Delco MRKH Jen. So definitely check me out. I talk a little bit each day about, something I thought about through the process or through my infertility journey. As I said, I've been, on this path for 15 some years, and, it's always going to be a part of who I am. And I think the more we talk about infertility and normalize it, the more I think everyone going through it feels seen and represented, and, know that, the struggle is real, but there's a lot of people there to support you.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful community. It really is. It's one of those communities you don't want to be a part of, but you love the people so much.
Yeah. What's it? The worst club, best members?
Yes, it's true. Best members ever. I'm very happy to be working with those members. They're just beautiful people I've met, and you included, and I'm so happy to have you on today. So thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you.
So that concludes today's episode. You can find all of the links mentioned on the episode notes. If you're enjoying these episodes, please take a moment to share and leave a review. Reviews mean everything to podcasters, and I really enjoy hearing from my listeners. You can also find me on my website at www.thewholesomelotus.com or email me at info@thewholesomelotus.com. I love hearing from my listeners. If you're interested and want updates as well as a free ebook on my top 10 fertility boosting habits, you can visit my fertility page on www.thewholesomelotus.com. I thank you so much for listening in and hope that you have a beautiful day.